Welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery programming series for our current exhibition, Sequence. This is curated by Christine DePiro Abbott, and today we are thrilled to present the artist Tara Yarzand. As a brief reminder, everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode, so feel free to utilize that chat function to ask questions, and we'll be sure to get to them at the end of the talk. Also, please keep in mind that because we're presenting from separate locations, there may be some variation of bandwidth, so if one of us freezes up or the sound fluctuates, thanks in advance for bearing with us. All right, welcome everyone, and welcome Tara.
Thank you so much for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be a part of the Sequence exhibition at the Ohio Arts Council Rife Gallery. It's such an amazing group of artists in the show, and I'm so happy that I get to be a part of it. Special thanks to Christine Abbott, the curator, and of course, Kat Sheridan and the crew for being just so incredible to work with. I'm very excited to be here, share my journey with you all. My talk is not specifically about printmaking, which this exhibition Sequence was about. I am a printmaker. I'm also a painter, and I'm going to talk about my journey as an artist and my process in general. Okay, so I'm going to start from the beginning, sort of, and my inspirations, but I will also go back and forth here and there to better explain my thought process and ideas. I am from Iran, born and raised in Tehran, the capital. I was not always an artist. My career path was very different. I got my bachelor's degree in finance in Iran, and then I went to England to get my master's degree in finance. But always in the back of my mind was the dream of becoming a professional artist. And after moving to the United States with my husband, after a while, I decided to take a leap and go for it, go after my passion. So I went to University of Toledo, got my BFA in 2021. It was a great experience for me. The faculty and the mentors were incredible, and I learned a lot. And I couldn't be happier about my decision and this change of direction in my life. About my work, I always loved pomegranates. I connect with them visually, with the color, with the shape, the seeds that are inside in this organized, beautiful way. This is an example of an early work featuring a pomegranate, but pomegranates are also valuable in Persian culture, Iranian culture, and Persian literature and poetry. And so I now use them in my works as a representation of my cultural background. Pomegranates were originated in Iran, and they are central in Iranian national celebrations, such as Yalda Night, which it's celebrated on the winter solstice. Yalda means birth, and it celebrates the victory of light over darkness as the days get longer from this point on in the Persian calendar. And pomegranates symbolize this victory, and they represent the cycle of life. Being in business school and with my degree in finance, they taught me skills that I use in my artistic career as well. Skills such as problem solving, investigation, research skills, which helped me a lot in my works and the thoughts behind each work. But on the other hand, business school focused a lot on being in control all the time, and which is something that kind of showed in my early days as an artist with my careful planning and tight brush strokes and just being in control and perfect all the time. But during my education at the University of Toledo, I learned to let myself be a little loose in the process. I learned trying stuff, making mistakes, piling up examples and samples. And I learned that art can be about just being with materials and so many possibilities. And the importance of just experimenting. So when I was introduced to printmaking in school, it really helped me with this new way of thinking and working. This is one of my early works after learning screen printing. It was one of the first works I started with an idea in my head, and I wasn't exactly completely sure where it would take me. I learned to be excited for what could happen with my experiments and not be afraid of what could go wrong. And after graduation, I set up a studio at my house and continued working and experimenting. Now I think I do a little bit of both types of practice in my art, the tight, careful brush strokes, but versus layers and layers of materials until the tight patterns that I create are sometimes hard to recognize. And also embracing and appreciating the element of chance and, happy accidents. One of the artists that I admire is Shirin Nashad. She's an Iranian-American artist. I like how she incorporates Persian calligraphy and patterns in her works. And that inspired me to incorporate traditional Persian imagery and patterns in my own work. So I started to experiment and collect and create patterns. This is an early example of my experiments with patterns. And then I thought about bringing my two interests together, pomegranates and ancient Persian patterns and motifs. And I started experimenting with different patterns, ideas, mediums. The one on the left is taken exactly from a traditional pattern, Persian pattern, and the one on the right is a pomegranate seeds pattern that I created myself and I started to use a lot in my works. The reason behind this interest is that my cultural background plays a big role in my works. It is a strange feeling to have two different countries that I call home and I love, Iran and United States. And it feels as if I belong to two very different things, one foot here, one foot in the other. But also, it sometimes feels like I do not fully belong to either of them. So there is this in-between space, this duality that I feel. And I look for a balance both in my life and in my art. And this is what I try to explore and to portray in my works. I like to mix different mediums and techniques. This is from a series of fingerprint pomegranates. The base of the open pomegranates are CMYK screen printed, and I worked on them with acrylic and then added these fingerprints with printmaking ink. And I asked other people to contribute as well. They're not just my fingerprints. And the pattern around the central pomegranates are from Persian traditional imagery. They are acetone transferred with the press machine onto the paper. It's a very simple but useful technique. And I also have connected these solid painted areas with the pattern with these subtle lines all around the paintings. And also the edges of the papers are cut in shapes that you see here. So they are floating in space in the shapes that you see. And I chose these shapes because I thought they work best with the flow of the pattern in each individual piece, the pattern around the central pomegranate. These are some close-up images. The details are easier to see here, especially the fingerprints. Now I want to talk about the work that I have in the Rife Gallery exhibition. While experimenting, I realized that I talk about an in-between space a lot, a feeling of not completely belonging. So I thought to better show this space, this idea, I can create complex layers and to make an interaction between the negative and positive space. And these images are the inspiration that I use. They are historical ancient sites in Iran, very beautiful. I have been in these spaces myself, and the feeling and the vibe remained with me, and the beauty. It was just so inspiring. So that's why I use many variations of them in my works. This is an in-progress photo. I screen printed these using the CMYK technique, in which you layer 4 colors on top of each other in the order of cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, and they recreate the initial image. It is in fact the oldest color reproduction print method, and I love this technique because there are various possibilities. I can make a little change in the process and the outcome would be different. I'm going to talk about it more later in the talk. I mentioned that I like to combine different techniques, right? So this combination for me creates a hybrid surface to create complex layers on. So for this project, for example, I learned to work with the laser machine to cut, engrave, or raster remove a layer. The black designs in the middle are the shapes that I made for the raster setting on the laser machine. I removed some of the CMYK ink to sort of open up the pieces a little bit, give them room to breathe. And I experimented with different settings on the laser machine to find out what I want, because different settings can change the amount of ink layers that the machine can remove. So I had to do a trial and error process to find out the suitable setting for my project. The other two designs, I don't know how much of them you can really see. The lines are very thin, but they are the shapes that I designed to engrave on the panels. One of them, on the right, is an old map of the city Tehran, where I was born and raised. And the other one on the left is a pomegranate tree shape that I came up with and create. You can see the pieces with the map here. This is one example with the pomegranate tree design, which is the more central piece in the series. Also, this is a stencil that I made for this project, cutting wood with laser. The shape is a deconstructed Persian pattern. I took the elements out of a complicated pattern, and I used that to spray paint on some of the panels, which you can see here and here. So you see that a lot of my created shapes and images are based on ancient Iranian patterns and imagery and motifs and symbols. But what I do is that I take these cultural elements and I take them apart, deconstruct them, reshape them, and I mix them with my own sketches and designs and make them my own in a way. They are still recognizable as Persian, but they are not the exact shapes that you will see just anywhere. I mentioned that I love the process of keeping every little sketch of creation that I come up with and keeping them in my sketchbook for future to use. For example, this piece that I'm about to show, it started with a little sketch, the one on the left. It's a very abstract, open pomegranate. And I then created a background for my work using this sketch by going back and forth between hand painting and working digitally. I turned it into sort of a mandala. I chose the shape of mandala because it is used in many cultures around the world, Eastern and Western. And Persian mandala, also like the others, is created by drawing many rays around the center, which is a symbol of a universe and every creature that's in it. And then here's the finished work. I use the Farsi letters of the word cosmopolitan. Farsi is the official language of Iran. I kind of transformed the letters into a pattern, shapes as a way to reference the value of poetry and calligraphy in Persian visual arts history. And also the old map of Tehran, which was in the other pieces, is present in this work as well. And I printed the whole thing on fabric and I mounted it on wood panel. And then I poured this gold acrylic over it, embracing the element of chance that we talked about. Here's some detailed images. And then I painted these pomegranate seeds in oil and added the gold pattern on the poured paint in the lower part of the painting in acrylic. Oh, was meant to go back. So you see the whole image again. Now let's look at this design. This is also something that I painted in my sketchbook. It is the same design I used to engrave on some of the panels that are in the Rife Gallery sequence show. I was very happy with this little creation of mine that I decided to use it in more pieces in different ways. Again, choosing different elements, taking them apart, reassembling them in my own way. And then I hand painted all these little details and patterns you see here in the details. I took them to Photoshop and computer to create this whole image. And then I printed it on a cotton fabric, mounted it on wood panel with matte medium, and then I painted with oil on top of it. Here's the finished piece. The oil painted areas in blue are the Farsi letters for the word dream, the translation of the word dream in Farsi. The concept is that I was thinking about the American dream. And as for the choice of colors, I was thinking of American colors, blue and red, if we refer to the flag. And juxtaposing these elements with the Persian elements of the pattern. And so making a whole complete painting containing references to both cultures. And then I wanted to make other pieces using this little design. For example, here, the design is in the center. It is the main focus, whereas in the previous work, the little designs were all partly hidden behind the painted Farsi letters. Some parts of them are hidden behind the letters, but here it is the focal point. And using the same design in different ways, I should say that this fabric was not the easiest to paint on with watercolor and acrylic. It sort of steals the paint and eats it, but I embraced this characteristic and I thought that it would be nice to use this to my advantage to create transparency effect in some areas. I like how the pattern underneath it shows through the watercolor painted sections, especially in the pomegranates. Another example with the same design, this time as a 2 plates etching project. So in the etching process, images are graved on copper plates with metal tools, and then you can create highlight and shadow areas into the metal using acid. Here, for example, I used nitric acid. And then I used the Shinkolei technique. Here are the images that are transferred to paper with ink using a press machine. These are 2 proof images. I used 2 copper plates, and then the final step, they were printed on top of each other. I use the Shinkolei technique, so the red that you see here is not ink, it's actually a textured paper. And I like how some of the design transferred onto this red paper. Shinkolei is a printmaking technique. It comes from the French word shin, which means tissue, and collé, which means glue or paste. But this technique is not just simply gluing a paper on a piece like a collage. It's different. So this technique uses a 2-layered paper support. A thinner paper is pre-cut in the shape that you want, and by using the press machine and glue, it is sort of bonded into a larger, thicker support paper, which is underneath it. And usually tissue papers are used for the Shinkolei technique, but I wanted to experiment with this beautifully textured red paper. I thought it was a perfect paper for a pomegranate. I talked about how I love to use the little sketches and designs that I paint. I love the process of keeping every little sketch or creation that I come up with and keeping them in my sketchbook for future to use. And at one point, I can combine them together and use them in a new and fresh way. These shapes here, they are little sketches that I kept and used them in new works, such as here, by taking them to Photoshop and combining them to create this pattern. And then I printed it on fabric. these are the inspiration behind the composition of the work, a historic palace in Iran. And the concept was that, so I talked about the in-between space that I feel like I'm in, and the balance that I look for in my life. I try to maintain this balance to bridge the gap between the two countries, Iran and United States. And this is the concept that I had in mind when I was working on this piece. So I also have included a poem by Rumi, the well-known Iranian poet, here in Farsi letters. It's very subtle, it's all over the piece, and it's especially connecting the divided parts like a bridge. And it says that the only constant is change, and accepting that is the way to find balance and inner peace. We can look at the details better here. I have another version of this work. I painted on top of it with solid color and then transferred a gold pattern into this solid painted areas. It's very, very subtle. Might be able to see better here, the detailed shots. The idea behind it is that I was thinking about fresco ruins that are destroyed by age, and you can only see a faint pattern that has remained. And you see it in some areas only when you look more closely. I was in fact sitting in an art history class learning about frescoes when this idea came to me. So now I want to show something quite different that inspired a new series of work. Earlier, I talked about how after my business school days and focusing on being in control all the time, I tried to embrace the element of chance a little more. Also, on the other hand, something that was always so beautiful and inspiring to me was stained glasses. Actually, they're colorful reflections, in fact. Both in Eastern and Western cultures, stained glasses are used a lot. And this piece was made for an exhibition at University of Toledo Gallery. The inspiration behind the design was a ceiling pattern in a historic ancient building in Iran. And I used the plot machine to create this shape on an adhesive paper, and then I put it on top of mirrors. And so the reflection would be in the shape of this pattern. It was interesting to see the reflection of the mirrors in natural sunlight versus the inside indoor gallery lights. They have very different effects. I filmed a timeline video to show the change of sunlight reflections on the wall. Let's see. After this project, I was thinking of a way to create abstraction with it. So I mentioned that the main thing that attracts me to stained glasses are their reflections, like what you see here. I started to collect stained glass reflections from Iran's cultural sites. There were many, many examples. And then I played with the images and made them even more abstract. So they would be less literal and would not be recognizable right away. I made a lot of CMYK screen prints with them. And what I really love about screen printing is the visual texture that it creates. It's different from when you paint something. I started experimenting and to create a few pieces with these screen printed reflections that I had made. Here is an early example that I tried, combining it with the pomegranate seeds pattern that I'd created a while back. And another more complex example is this one. I scanned the screen prints, took them to Photoshop, and then went back and forth between digital work and hand painting and created this pattern around the reflection. Then it is printed on fabric, mounted on wood panel, and I painted on top of it with acrylic, especially the pomegranate seeds, to give them more body and shine. The shape that is in the center, it's a geometric star polygon. You can see examples here. It's a very dominant shape in Persian patterns and architecture especially. It's called gire. It's the translation of the word knot in Farsi. Here are some close-up images. This was my BFA thesis work. You can see the tiny details here better. They were all hand-painted and then combined in computer before being printed on fabric. Let's look at the complete piece here again. But I still was not done with the stained glass reflections, so I made this one, 25 wood panels on the wall. I cut the screen printed papers that I had made in these organic shapes and mounted them on wood panels. And then I added this textured paper in the shape of a Persian pattern to unite the pieces. So each piece is complete on its own, but all together they make one bigger, more complex piece. Similar to the idea of a whole pomegranate with so many seeds inside it, which are beautiful and complete on their own, but even more so when they're all together. The corner pieces are also screen prints. We looked at similar ones earlier in the talk. I continued the yellow pattern on them, but instead of using the yellow paper, I used the stained glass reflection screen printed paper. We can see it better here. So I did that so that all 25 panels have a mutual element in them, which makes them cohesive and turn them into one united work. Moving on from the stained glasses, I painted this a while ago because I wanted to incorporate patterns into figures. To define the figure, I especially paid attention to the contour edges for definition and wanted them to affect the pattern. So the pattern remains flat throughout the whole form, similar to all Persian patterns. Mostly they are flat, but it shifts position on different sides of a particular contour line. Especially in the hand and in the fingers, you can see that, so that it feels like it's those edges that are affecting the pattern. And then this inspired me to think about making more of this type of work with figure, but pushing the patterns even farther. Again, I wanted to use the little sketches and designs that I paint and incorporate them into a painting, since this process is very enjoyable for me. Every little geometric shape is filled with a unique design, and the soft lines of these designs and Persian patterns that are depicting flowers and foliage are juxtaposed with the geometric shapes and triangles, which I think it creates a nice balance, the sharp angles and the soft lines and flowers. Keeping geometrical shapes in mind, which are dominant in Persian imagery, I painted this. Again, the shape in the middle is the geometric star and polygon, which was present in another work we just looked at earlier, which, as I mentioned, is a shape that is utilized a lot in Persian patterns and architecture. Another thing about this painting is the color, obviously. We know the color is a powerful tool. Iranian national colors, if I refer to the flag, are red and green, and American colors are blue and red. And I do use color intentionally in many of my works, but this time I wanted to really emphasize that, a dominantly blue painting with Persian patterns and elements, sort of juxtaposing these two sides of me, Iranian and American. Here's another piece inspired by ancient architecture and intentional choice of color. I think focusing on math and geometry in high school and then studying finance might be the reason that I get inspired a lot by architecture. that side of me that enjoys careful and perfect planning kind of shows itself here. Anyways, I mentioned this about my process that I gather patterns and photos of cultural architectural sites in Iran, and I compile them in an archive, basically a folder on my computer, and then use the archive as a resource for my painting process. Of course, they evolve from their original source, simulating an organic development of form and pattern as a visual language. We have blue as a main color here again, but some red pomegranate seeds, red being the mutual color between my two countries. Here are some close-up pictures. You can see that the surface is textured. It's because I use frog tape underneath the paint in some areas to create texture, and there are many layers of paint too. I also have some transparent color areas here and there to create a more visual complexity and interest. This is the architectural source. And also the design that I created, which was painted on top. I was just so happy with this shape that I'd made that I wanted to use more variations of it in other works as well, which leads us to this one. Again, the architectural reference behind the pattern is full of geometrical shapes, but they are a little softer compared with the previous geometric works. You can see the elements that I used here. In general, geometric shapes are thought to reflect the unity of the universe, and they're used a lot in Persian imagery, also in other cultures as well. These are some close-up details. I thought it's interesting when these shapes are placed side by side with this type of soft pattern, with these lines, and they depict flowers and other foliage. It creates a visual interest and balance, in my opinion. Now, these are more designs that I made. They're full of rhythmic, linear patterns, intertwining plants, floral designs, and motifs that they're all very common in Persian imagery. Using those designs, I made a series of CMYK screen prints, and then I painted on them with acrylic. And then I screen printed another layer on top and hand painted again. There's so many layers intertwined that you can't really tell which layer was done first necessarily. Again, I'm referencing the in-between space that I feel I'm in, which points to my duality in culture, direction, life paths. This is another piece from the series. CMYK technique, in my opinion, is one of those things that they say you should learn the rules so you can break them. For me, that's what I do with it. I can create a perfectly precise and exact CMYK screen print, but in my works, I think about ways that I can change this rule. I can create a blurry effect if I move the paper a little bit. I can decide to skip a layer or do it twice or change the order. And each time the result can be a little different. The color can be a little warmer or a little cooler. And it gives me new textures, new aesthetics that I can play with and change as I please. And this experimental side of printmaking is something that I absolutely love. That is everything. Thank you, everyone, for listening. This is my website and my social media handle. Feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tara. Folks, if you have questions, go right ahead and pop them into the chat there. In the interim, let's see, what inspired you to combine painting and printmaking. So clearly you have those two things, and then you have really brought them together quite a bit. Can you chat about how you came into that space and how you see yourself going?
So I think the main reason that I like to do this mixing is that it helps me with creating more complicated layers to create that in-between space that I talked about. Using each of those techniques alone, painting or screen printing is beautiful and it is interesting, of course, but mixing them together, it gives me different textures side by side, and it helps me better find and create these layered and entangled and intertwined patterns that I like to make in my works. I started doing that by just experimenting and seeing like, oh, that works, and then doing more of that. And yeah, learning how I like to mix these techniques. Is it the laser machine, painting, screen printing, all of that together.
Great. So we have a question from Bahanas. I am sure that I slaughtered that. Your journey of becoming a professional artist was inspiring. What is your advice to those ones out there that don't have the courage to follow their passion and think it's too late?
Well, it's never too late. um, I I couldn't be happier about changing this direction in my career and in my life. It was not easy at first. I totally get it. It's hard to let go of what you know, what you worked so hard to get, like your degrees or your career or whatever it is. But I was not happy. I always felt like this is not for me. My creative side could not show itself in that department. So I decided to just do what I've always loved to do. Of course, I did my research. I planned ahead a little bit, but I also took a leap of faith, and I'm very happy with the results.
All right. So curious, what draws you to working predominantly in a square format for so many of your prints?
Right. The main reason I think at first subconsciously was look for balance, search for balance. I feel like the square is a more balanced shape. And some of my works, not all of them, but some of them you can look at in different directions and it would still work. Um, I think that's what I wanted to achieve in my life, to change something and it would still work. So maybe I feel like I started being drawn to the square shape at first subconsciously because of this reason, and then it was more intentional with the patterns that I create, with the shapes that I want to have. This was the shape that worked best in a lot of my work. Not all of them, of course.
All right. Christina asked, well, comments, and then asks, thank you so much for a lovely presentation. The work is amazing, very poetic and rich. I love the layers and how you reference them both as part of the work, but also context. There are more subtle connections with M.C. Escher's work, I guess by the virtue of being influenced by math and geometry. Besides architecture, what might be other art influence or artists that intrigue you? And thank you again for sharing your amazing work.
Thank you so much for your nice comments. Yes, I do reference architecture a lot, and I think part of it is because I was so focused on math in high school. That was one of the reasons that I did not get into art. So in Iran, when you are a good student, if you're good at math, becoming an artist is not really an option. You have to go into being a doctor or engineer or a businesswoman or person. But I think this education, this process Part of it is still inside me because as I said, being in control all the time, being good with careful planning, trying to let go of that, but there's a part of it still here. And architecture is a good example for that. You have to really plan ahead to achieve something, which might look beautiful and effortless, but there's so much effort behind it. And I think that's one thing that I really love about it and inspires me. And as for artists, I mentioned Shirin Nishad. She was the main inspiration behind that I got into patterns, working with patterns. I looked at her work, her calligraphy, and I was like, oh, this is beautiful. I can reference so many of these visual patterns that I have in my mind that I grew up with, seeing them everywhere. I can use them in my work, but I also wanted them to be a little different. So that's why I take elements from them and connect these elements and make new shapes, new things, but they are heavily influenced by these cultural patterns, traditional imagery.
Great. So something that you perhaps chatted very briefly about, but I would love for you to say a little bit more about, printmaking is a unique method within the arts in that it requires community because of the presses that you need, right? And so painting, on the other hand, can be very isolating. So can you chat a bit about the importance of printmaking within community and how that has impacted your work?
So I was introduced to printmaking in University of Toledo when I started my BFA, and I was hooked at first. I have still yet to find a place and a community to do more screen printing. I have a painting studio at my house, but of course, as you mentioned, sorry about that. Of course, I mentioned that having a printmaking studio is not easy at your house. There are so many tools, so many necessities for it. I am lucky to be able to use the University of Toledo studio for this matter. But I'm hoping to find a better community somewhere else to meet more printmaking artists.
Wonderful. All right, and I think we'll close out on a comment from Julie that says, I love the way you incorporate writing into your work, especially the inclusion of Rumi. Very inspirational, and thank you. So, Tara, again, thank you for the generosity of your time and talent, and thank you all for joining us for this artist talk by Tara Yarzand as a part of the programming series for Sequence. I'd like to give a special thank you to the curator, Christine DePiro Abbott. A big thank you to all the other participating artists, as well as the Ohio Arts Council's board, Ohio legislature, and the governor who support the Ohio Arts Council, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists. Thanks and have a great day.